My name is Ashley, and this is Let's Talk Dispatch.
I do. You're gonna do it. Do it really well.
And I believe the world needs more dispatchers.
Around in the mud, blood, and
plus
beer.
years that I'm not working 4th of July. 4th of July.
Saying community policing, right? What about community dispatch?
So on this show, with the help of my guests, we will educate, empower, and support the heroes behind the headset.
Right.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode here on Let's Talk Dispatch with me, Ashley, the Raspy Dispatcher. I just wanted to take a moment to talk about an awesome resource that we have available that's relatively new at the Raspy Dispatcher. It's our monthly webinar, Unpacking the Process. This is for folks who are interested in becoming 911 dispatchers, haven't really dived fully into what it is that we do in this line of work, and are wanting someone to be available to interact with, ask questions. It's all done virtually. It's about an hour session where I give a presentation on the job and answer general questions that come up during that discussion. So we've done about 2 or 3 of them, and it's been really fun being able to just give people an understanding of what the heck they're getting into, answer general questions that they may have that their departments aren't available to answer, and just kind of give them, some confidence going into this process. So if you know someone who's interested in applying for a job as a 911 dispatcher, send them over to the raspydispatcher.com. If you're a department that doesn't have the bandwidth to, create informational sessions or answer questions for your applicants, this is also a resource that you can point them in the direction to. It is $25, and with that $25, you get the person going to the webinar gets a copy of our Winning Over the Panel interview packet. So all of it is really created for and geared towards helping folks prepare for this process to successfully get through and hopefully into trainings to help decrease the shortages in our centers. So check out the raspydispatcher.com for that and so much more. So after the end of my shameless plug, we're going to get to our episode today. Today we're chatting with private sector startup founder of Aurelian, and where they're building software that animates non-emergency calls for 911 centers. And if you've been listening to my podcast, I love learning about and talking about technology, and it's a real clean slate today. I really have no information about this product, so I'm going to bring on our guest today, Max, to tell us all about it.
Hi. Thanks for having me. When Halcyon first kind of told me about your podcast and mentioned I should be on, I went through a lot of the episodes, and I'm glad you lowered your standards a little bit to be able to have me on today.
Well, Halcyon's check hasn't cleared yet, so I don't know if.
Well, hopefully it won't embarrass her.
Oh my gosh. It's, what it is honestly one of the things that I love about connecting with folks in this space. I mean, Halcyon's obviously an amazing individual. She's kind of branching off into her own company right now currently. So if you folks are listening, Under the Headset with Halcyon, follow her on Instagram, check out our website. She actually just dropped this really cool training card deck that's on pre-order that I picked up. So she's got a lot of stuff cooking and really putting that stuff out into the dispatcher world for us to better improve ourselves. But so Halcyon, connecting folks like you and me and being able to share this information is really one of the main reasons that we do this.
Yeah, no, and it's really great to be on, and it's an honor.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much. And tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in, this project, this business, and how you got involved with the dispatch world.
Yeah, I'd say we probably have like one of the most non-traditional entry points into 911. And, my co-founder and I, we were working on an entirely different product, an entirely different space that was I'd say like a middling success. And, we felt after about a year in, we were like, this just isn't impacting people the way that we wanted it to. So we went right back to the drawing board and And one of our investors and a great mentor kind of has this famous quote. His name's Paul Graham. Is that live in the future and build what's missing.
Mm.
And that's what we try to do. We try to think like, what is the future going to look like, and how can we make that a reality? So one of the things that I always hated was phone calls. Like I hate having to call people. I'd be an awful dispatcher.
Yeah.
And I also hate it when like I'm in person at like my doctor's office and I'm checking in and they're like, hold on a minute, I need to like answer this call. Those are the things that really bother me. So we started looking at like, how can we automate phone calls? And originally it was for small businesses. And we really started with salons, actually, like hair salons.
Okay. Yeah.
You could talk about the reasoning why, but the main point was like they get a lot of calls and the calls aren't that valuable to them.
Yeah.
And while we were automating calls for salons, we kind of coincidentally ran into the non-emergency line. So it happened 2 times in kind of 2 ways simultaneously. So the first one of our customers had a massive school pickup line blocking all of her parking spots. And justifiably so, she called the non-emergency line. Waited about 30 minutes and then hung up and called 911. And, we see this happen all the time. The dispatcher was obviously very upset. Like if there's a wait time for the non-emergency line, there's usually a reason.
Yeah.
But that kind of got us looking at it. And then simultaneously, my girlfriend's dad had a schizophrenic person walk into his auto repair shop. So he called the non-emergency line, waited, similar amount of time, right around 30 minutes, hung up, he's like, I don't care that much.
Yeah.
Then he later saw them on the news and he called again and waited another 30 minutes. And then he was like, I'm just done. And then, so those kind of got us looking into the space. And really the thing that excited us the most is we saw this like, it's quoted pretty frequently now, but I think it might've been from Mission Critical Partners, the stat that the average PSAP is 30% understaffed. And we kind of saw, and that was like, the first understanding of like why there's wait times in the non-emergency line. We're like, oh, there's this massive staffing shortage. And that's why, I love your work of like trying to get more people into dispatch, because it's like, it's a tough sell. It's a hard job and it's not for everyone. But and then, so we kind of saw that. And then I started just visiting, any 911 center that would have me. And I would go in there and, the very first one that I visited, I remember massive center in Florida, about 100 dispatchers, give or take. And they were staffed they had budget for 130. So, right around the national 30% understaffed. And I was talking to her and she said that they take around 200,000 911 calls a year. And I was doing the math in my head and I was like, so you have 100 dispatchers, full-time person works 2,000 hours. You're taking 200,000 calls. That's like a call an hour. Like that seems like nothing. Like, how are you understaffed? And then she said, oh, no. We also take 100,000. We take 1 million non-emergency calls on top of that. And that's when that was like a eureka moment where I was like, so you guys are understaffed by 30%, but 80% of your calls are non-emergency calls. And that's the long story of like how we got excited about working in 911.
And it's a wonderful story in the sense that like you went and got invested into these centers because, to speak frankly about software sometimes in the dispatch world is that everything's great in theory, right? Like folks who are great in software, they create this thing like this is going to be wonderful. You're going to use it in your center. It's going to help with X, Y, Z. And then they put it in the center and they haven't taken the time to actually go in and see how these things actually work in the center, how opening multiple screens affects us, how, we're utilizing radio at the same time we're doing phones, and all these just aspects that just no one knows unless they take the time to go in and talk to the people doing the job. So just you going in and having those conversations to start, I know goes a long way in your guys' product, probably creating actionable results in these centers.
Yeah. And this is like one thing that I always harp on a lot. There's a lot of people who early in our like progression, and the one that I always talk about is Brad Flanagan, who like had us come in, who had us like sit side by side with the dispatchers for multiple days, because like we weren't dispatchers. We were just people who like, honestly, from a caller perspective, wanted this problem solved.
Yeah.
And then being able to see like one, that I could never be a dispatcher. Like I like joke that I can hardly like walk and chew gum at the same time, like let alone like listen to like fire on the radio and also manage a 911 call and enter it into CAD all at the same time. Like that's just,
Mhm.
it's something I would never be able to do.
Mhm.
So like having, these directors and assistant directors like literally sit down and have us connect with dispatchers and learn about their work has been like
Mhm.
incredibly helpful. And when we think about like what kind of leads to innovation in 911, like I think that's one of the biggest things is
Mhm.
having a willingness to talk to these people who just want to solve problems and then showing
Mhm.
them like these are the problems that are worth solving.
Yeah. And it does take, I mean, change in general is a struggle for folks. And then you talk about change in dispatch center. I mean, getting folks to buy into anything new, I would say in law enforcement, I would say in first responder industry. I mean, it's a tough sell, I mean, let alone a budget, an infrastructure conversation. It's just people don't like change.
Yeah.
How have you guys gone about like tackling that conversation or um, getting folks to kind of buy into this new idea or way of doing things?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing that we see that leads to like a successful implementation is clear expectations of what's going to happen and being able to
Mhm.
set those from the high level. Like the director being able to tell the dispatchers and the team, like, this is exactly what we're going to be doing. This is why it's going to work. This is why we've decided to do this. And then
Mhm.
being able to pass that on and then like actually be able to show like how it's going to affect their workflows. That
Mhm.
ends up being really important. And the other thing is, for us, we target things that people hate and that ends up being a little bit easier than targeting something that people do, but they
Mhm.
don't necessarily mind.
Mhm. Mhm.
So that definitely from a dispatcher perspective gives people a little bit more willingness to like, put up with an implementation and put up with something that changes your workflow. And,
Mhm.
the other thing I think that, goes with any product is just being really receptive of people's concerns. The thing that I always tell everyone is like, if you give me a suggestion, there's a chance it will happen, there's a chance it will not, but we'll
Mhm.
always look at the actual underlying problem that you're trying to solve with your suggestion.
Mhm. Mhm.
And what we find is that a lot of times, like people have suggestions that are like solving real problems, and just by
Yeah.
listening to them and then iterating on that, you build a product that gets better and better over time.
Mm. So what does your product look like in these centers when you guys implement them? How does it work for these centers when they utilize you folks?
So this is one of my favorite moments of like probably my entire life is like when the system when we flip the system on, because what happens is it's just like it's silence. Like
Mm.
you can imagine like 80% of your call volume, it's we usually say it's around like 60 to 80% depending on the center, literally
Mhm.
just stops ringing through.
Wow.
And from a I hate I didn't want this to be like a pitch the product podcast, but from like a actual dispatcher perspective, what it means is that our agent is talking to the person, and from there we're creating action items for them to do. So
Mm.
oftentimes what it is like somebody's reporting that somebody barked in their driveway or like someone's dog is barking, and we've collected all the relevant information of like this is the address, this is the caller's name, this is their phone number, any additional information that might be relevant, like this is the type of the car that's blocking their driveway, and then they
Mm.
put that into their CAD and to determine like when and if a person should respond.
Mm.
And so you imagine it takes the 60 to 80% of the call volume and it turns it all async.
Mhm.
So you don't
Mhm.
have to worry about this non-emergency call ringing through, and you can handle the 911 call, or you can go get water, or you can go to the bathroom.
What do you
Um,
bathroom breaks? What's
yeah,
that?
and that's kind of fundamentally what it's like when the product turns on, and really
Mm.
it does entirely change their workflow.
Mm.
Usually what it means is that there's a few people who are like designated to running our system on staff at any time.
Mm.
What we're seeing some of the centers do is they're actually making this a remote position.
Mm.
So like for these are non-emergency calls. You don't need to be in the center. One of them, like somebody is on maternity leave, and like instead of having her come back after 6 weeks, they're just having
Mhm.
her work 10 to 5 during the busiest hours, Monday through Friday, and taking all the calls remotely.
Mm.
So it adds a little bit of like, you can kind of handle these wherever and whenever.
Mhm. And is there a way to route so folks are gonna be human? And I have taken emergency calls on non-emergency numbers is the idea that you can quickly get them to the right place, or is the idea that the folks who are working on this back end answering the non-emergency are equipped to handle the 911 calls as well if they slip through?
Yeah. So, and talking about, this kind of goes hand in hand with like how we've built the product of just like,
Mhm.
we literally just talk to people at 911 and we use their suggestions. And, I
Uh-huh.
shamelessly took this one from Brad.
Uh-huh.
Um, so we kind of constantly monitor for emergency situations.
Mhm.
And,
Mhm.
I would say that there's kind of two different things that end up getting transferred to an actual, dispatcher. And
Mhm.
there's one, it's an emergency situation that needs an immediate response. Like this could be like a car accident with an injury. This could be,
Mhm.
somebody whose mom just fell down the stairs. Like one of the most common ones that we see are older people calling about medical things.
Mhm.
We immediately tell them to hang up and call 911. But if they don't, in 10 seconds, they're transferred to a dispatcher immediately anyways.
Mhm.
Obviously, the reason why we want them to hang up and call 911 is we want the dispatcher to have Annie and Allie. Just makes
Yeah.
that a little bit easier.
Mhm.
So we always do have the way of sending calls to a dispatcher if needed. Now, the other category of calls that we send is like there are a lot of calls that are non-emergent that don't really need a human right now, but like
Mhm.
the human touch is so valuable.
Yeah.
And the example I always say is like sexual assaults, domestic violence, people
Mhm.
asking for the coroner because it's collecting a dead body a lot of the time. We
Yeah.
shouldn't be handling those calls at all. Like I don't care if we can.
Mhm.
There's this level of like human touch that is so valuable there.
Yeah.
And those are calls that we just immediately pass through.
Mhm. Do you find that, I mean, I would say that one of the main uh, concerns, right, about us being understaffed and, receiving X amount of calls, whether it's non-emergency or 911, is just like this burnout factor, right? Like, one of the things to talk about on 911 is like, I'll go from, cat in the tree to, I've been shot, and then back to cat in the tree. And it's just kind of this, roller coaster ride, especially in these larger centers that are working in cities with higher crime rates. And have you seen in the places that utilize your software kind of a decrease in this burnout or a decrease in this being overwhelmed with the amount of calls they're receiving?
Yeah, and I'd love to do like a longer study on this.
Yeah.
We just haven't been live long enough to get really good information on it. I
Mhm,
will say, like in terms of just general workload, it definitely reduces it.
mhm,
I
mhm,
think like as we kind of reach the year mark with a lot of these places, it'd be great to kind of have like, okay, this is the baseline of like retention, this is the current retention, and kind of being
mhm.
able to see that. I just don't think we have enough data to like really make a great point now.
Yeah.
I will say one of the centers that we're starting an implementation with now, um, the over Memorial Day weekend, we were talking with them, and they had an officer involved shooting,
Mm,
and literally the worst situation imaginable. And then I was
mhm.
like, so how do you go from that, talking about it, to like somebody complaining about fireworks? Like, how is that even like in your when like there's a decent chance that there wasn't even fireworks, it was shooting.
Mhm.
And like how do you even like wrap your head around that?
I mean, it's definitely, I think when those things happen, I think you do fall back on your training. You kind of go call to call. And I think that is something that people don't realize. I've worked, an officer involved. I've worked a few officer involved shootings, but where we've actually had an officer, pass away from the incident. And majority of things stop, right? If it's not emergent, like the city typically stops, as long as
Yeah.
it's not in progress, something that needs a full response. A lot of other things are going to be delayed and put on hold for cold reports and things like that, just because the incident is so big. But the reality is that doesn't mean the calls don't stop coming in, right?
Yeah.
It's one of those significant differences when we talk about patrol versus 911. I did a reel the other day about, someone responded like, "Oh, I was sitting and answer phones for 12 hours." And it's just so different. The realities that patrol deals with versus dispatch. Patrol goes out to an officer involved shooting situation. They're there for the day. That's their call.
Yep.
Like they're investigating it, whether they were involved, they've been sidelined. Sergeants are out there. that's the call for the day. You're not going anywhere else. Or dispatch, we worked that call. Now we took 10 other calls in between the moment you got dispatched, and 2 hours later. So it's just one of those things that are just so different to patrol versus 911. I don't know if that makes sense, but
No, it definitely
it's
does.
just
And
reality. We
the other
can't
thing is, like,
stop.
every time you answer the phone, you just don't know what you're gonna get.
Mhm.
Even if it's coming in on the non-emergency line, you just have no idea.
Yeah. I mean, I had a call one time on non-emergency, and I was like, "Do you have an emergency or can you hold?" Because we're filtering calls.
Yep.
"No, I can hold." And, dispatcher guts, the way they said it, I was like, "I'm gonna pick that back up." So I picked it back up, and then I was like, "What are you reporting?" "Oh, I own a shop over here, and guy came in and tried to rob me, but I had my gun, so he's not here anymore." And I'm like, "Wait, what?" Guns were pulled? Like, what's that? Why are we calling non-emergency right now? So people, you just never know what's going to be reported at any point.
Yeah, it's the Wild West, and like, yeah, and that's like that was one of the things that I think was most shocking to me is the number of emergencies that come through the non-emergency line. So the
Mhm,
example that I always think of that really scares me is, like, I live in Seattle. My parents live in Tampa.
mhm.
Um, I know that if I'm on the phone with my mom and she passes out, whatever it may be, God forbid,
Mhm.
and it's at 5 o'clock, like, there's a decent chance that there's going to be a wait on the non-emergency line,
Yeah.
and there's
Mhm.
no way for me to contact them otherwise.
Yeah.
Like, and to me, that's like a like unfathomable idea that, like,
Yeah.
what do I do? I don't even know.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, so, like, I mean, most people just call 911. They'd get sent to Seattle's dispatch center, and Seattle would transfer them through the non-emergency line that
Mhm.
has a hold on it potentially.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and that's like just mind blowing to me.
Yeah. I mean, this idea again that we tend to always circle back to like education and 911 is like when people freak out, they just dial 911. And the
Yep.
reality is we're not all connected. Like if you're calling from, we're in California, if you need someone in Seattle, like we don't just have a button that's like, oh yeah, Seattle, boop. And it just, there are some services out there. Nina has a nice um, directory that PSAPs can get into for free and be able to plug in addresses and hopefully get a right number. But again, the best thing is if you are wherever you are, where the emergency is, being able to dial 911 because there's that delay factor in minutes saves lives.
Yeah, and then even then, like the Nina directory, those are the non-emergency lines. Like, that's
Hmm.
not like a backdoor line or anything like
Yeah.
that. Um,
Yeah. The infrastructure in 911, it's just not built to 2024 standards, like the realities that the everyday citizen lives in, like, what do you mean you don't know where I am? I can see my DoorDasher right here on this map. Like, what do you mean 911 doesn't know? Like,
yeah,
there's a disconnect, there's a gap, that I don't have the language to explain. But there is a gap with technology as we know it and have access to as private citizens, and that 911 has access to. Like, it's just there is a gap that we're trying to close here.
yeah. So there's this analogy that it's a very southern analogy. So a director in a 911 center in the South told me, and I love it. So I use it all the time.
Uh-huh.
Of if you like take a pot of boiling water and you
Uh-huh.
throw a frog into it, it jumps out.
Yeah.
But if you put the frog in cold water and then you boil it, it doesn't even realize. And
Yeah.
I feel like that's the perfect description for what 911 has become, where there are
Mhm.
just so many problems that have started from before a lot of people were even into the industry
Yeah.
that are just like perpetuated, or like small things that have kind of really bubbled up. Well, the
Mhm.
one that I always like use in examples, like 911 has just become the dumping ground for every city services after hours calls.
Yes.
It's like who
I don't think
decided
you
this?
understand how much dispatchers are like screaming listening to that statement right now.
Yeah, it's like everyone decided that, like, oh, PUD is down, send him send him to dispatch.
Yeah. Heck
And
yeah.
it's yeah, and that those are just things that I think of just, over years and years have, started out potentially small. And then
Mhm.
now it's like, you have the staffing issue, call volumes are almost always going up. Like,
Mhm.
I think that a lot of the work that you're doing, it was really helpful for this, but I think there's a good chance that most of these places will never be at full staff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
1000%. Yeah. Heck yeah.
and so they have to kind of like live in a world that they won't be in full staff.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think that directors need to be doing everything that they can to get the most out of their current staffing, because there's a good chance it's never going to be better than it is now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting thought. I mean, you have to create things for the reality that you're currently in, right? I mean, the idea, I talk about like the benefits for folks of shift work and like having days off and things like that. I have benefited greatly from shift work, and because I've been at agencies, oddly, that are fully staffed. And I mean, I worked at Sacramento Police Department, and while I was there for 4 years, we were fully staffed, and the current agency I work at, we're fully staffed as well. So I'm rare.
Yeah.
I think I am a odd duck, but I can't speak to when staffing's good, like the schedule's cool for the benefits of it, right? You work a little harder, longer during the week, you get some time off on the back end. But the reality is a lot of these centers, at least on average 30%, are not operating that way. So how do we take care of our people? How do we bring new ways of scheduling, new technology in, that are going to support our people in the current state and reality that they are currently operating in?
Yeah, and there's a stat that I love, and I think it's true, but I've heard it so many times and I've never actually seen a source, but that it's 97% of police officers who start as a police officer retire as a police officer.
Correct.
And for dispatchers, it's 3%.
Yes.
And so 3% of dispatch that starts as a dispatcher retire as one, or like retire just within 911.
Mm-hmm.
And people say like the average dispatcher lasts less than 2 years. Like there needs to be things done to improve the quality of life of the job. And one of the biggest ones is like mandatory overtime sucks. Like that's just like, it feels very obvious. Like,
yes,
need to cut that out. The other thing is like I talk about this a lot because I think it's relevant to us, but I feel like a lot of dispatchers have been kind of baited and switched. So the analogy I always like is like you train them to be Navy SEALs. So they can handle all of these black swan events, whether it be a plane crash, a school shooting, like God forbid.
Yeah.
But then like literally 90% of their time is done handling things that anyone could. Like I like to say like you train them as Navy SEALs, but they act as mall cops. Then it's like it's like it's like parking complaints, it's like barking dogs, it's like we get calls that people are needing fish and wildlife, and it's like, dude, you just call the non-emergency line.
1000%.
And at least for me, from an outsider perspective, I feel like that'd be like kind of frustrating that I went through all this training and then you're not utilizing my skill set properly.
And like I've heard it described as like we're paid to be able to, right? Like when those things happen, we are able to respond accordingly. Now, how often those things happen, hopefully, are very few and far between. But we are trained to be able to respond. But there is this reality, and you kind of mentioned it, of us becoming this informational hub for the city or a dumping ground, I think is a wonderful way to describe it, for after hours communications. And I think that can be frustrating for departments. And I also think there's people who are just like, well, you're there, you work for the city, you should be able to provide information about it, but also like I was hired to work in police. Like that's what I'm here for. So I don't know. I think it's finding this balance of, utilizing us well for the things that we're trained to do, as well as serving the citizens and their needs in the community that we're working in.
Yeah, and you mentioned like the callers definitely think they're like, well, you're a city employee, like you owe me this. That's definitely the attitude, especially we see all the time over the non-emergency line. Where like people are like, you're definitely calling the wrong place. You probably should have Googled this first.
I have said to many people, let me Google that for you. Like I
Yeah.
don't.
The
No
underlying
idea.
thing that I always like to mention is that the skill set of what makes somebody really good at handling 911 calls is like
Mhm.
entirely the opposite of what makes someone good for like general information questions. Like for 911 calls, you want someone who's like really curt, that's gonna get to the point as fast as possible. Yeah.
1000%.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and that can handle all these things at once. And then like,
Mhm.
otherwise you want someone that's like really like nice and conversational. It's gonna be like, of course I can do that for you. And you just can't expect that from somebody who's handling like, like I said before, like an officer involved shooting and then is going to take
Mhm.
your parking complaint because someone parked on your street for longer than 72 hours.
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain level of customer service, like, that comes with this line of work, you know?
Yeah.
Um, and then there's also the human aspect of, like, if I wasn't on this recorded line, the things that I would say to you, that's just the real, right? Like, who are you talking to right now type of vibe. And, like, sometimes you have to be really stern with people when they're calling about non-issues, right? Parking complaints, noise complaints, things like that. Like, I get this is a bother to you. I understand. I feel it. If I could send someone, I would. And I've had to tell, like, we're working a shooting. Like, and I've had people who don't care. Like, they do not correlate the fact that there's this other emergency happening being more important to what they got going on. And that's people, right? Like, that's, in this line of work, you get exposed to more people like that than not. But when you're going from call to call to call and you're dealing with that influx of human, it's tiring. It's
Yeah.
taxing.
One of the analogy or one of the I don't know if it's an analogy. One of the things I always like telling people is like, a lot of the calls we handle are things like if someone broke your car window and things like that. And
Mhm.
people who aren't in 911 often don't even realize that there's a non-emergency line to call.
Mhm. Mhm.
And the thing that I always tell them is like, it might feel like an emergency to you, but it's not actually an emergency. And
Yeah.
that's like where a lot of these calls feel like, because like to the person, like their day's ruined. And
Mhm.
I think it's a hard thing for dispatchers. It's a frustratingly difficult thing that
Yeah.
for that day, for that person, this is their entire day. Maybe it's their entire week.
Mhm.
And then, but for you, like you have so many other much more important priorities than
Yeah.
someone's like broken window that no one's ever going to do anything about anyways.
Yeah. Mhm. And I've had someone call 911 recently for littering. And it was like weird littering. It wasn't even like it was like someone was cutting hair on the sidewalk and they thought it was littering. And sometimes you have to like say out loud what they're saying to you. So like you're hoping they can hear it. Like you're calling 911 because someone's cutting hair on the sidewalk?
Yeah, and you're trying to
Yes.
figure out like,
Yeah,
is
and
this
you're
like
like
voluntary cutting hair? Like, is it just cutting random people's hair?
like you like I'm trying to get where you're going, like what made you because sometimes you got to unpack things and it doesn't. Well, no, they're cutting strangers' hairs who aren't, without consent. And they're like, okay, that's a guy running around with scissors, sure.
Yeah,
Um, but sometimes people default to whatever it is easy, instead of Googling, I'm just going to call 911, instead of taking the time to find a non-emergency number, I'm just going to dial these 3 digits. Someone will answer. And I think another reality people don't realize is that we don't have endless 911 lines at our agencies. Like we have literal, I believe the term is trunks, but it's like
yeah,
boxes, right? Like little places for 911 to drop. And if you're at a large agency, you probably have 20 boxes. If you're at a small agency, you might have 4. So if you're calling about this littering while a vehicle accident's coming in, that 5th call is going to get, hit a busy tone or roll over or like whatever the process is for your agency. But it's just that lack of knowledge. Like you are literally, when we say you're tying up a line, it is literal. It's not
yeah.
figuratively.
And that was something I never imagined when we first started
Mhm.
this. Is like a lot of these, yeah, it's like 8. You might have 8 lines,
Yeah.
and after that, you're going to be getting a busy tone. One thing that surprises me is the number of calls we get from the centers that we work with that are
Mhm.
sending them from 911 to us on the non-emergency line.
Mm.
And a
Mhm.
lot of them are like, things like somebody calls to report a dead animal on a private road.
Yeah.
And they're like, it's blocking the road. And they're like, we'll take a report. Maybe someone will respond,
Yeah.
but like, there's a good chance this is a private road. Like, unless
Yeah.
it's really close to a public road, there's no chance anyone's going to respond. And they send those
Mhm.
calls to us. And then the other thing is, I always think it's interesting how 911 calls and non-emergency calls, they come in like batches.
Mhm. Mhm.
And just being in a center live, you'll see like something will fall off a truck on a main road in the city.
Oh yeah,
And
those lines will blow up.
it's every caller, and it's, every time they're answering, it's, "Are you calling about the fallen
Yeah.
log?" Yep,
Yeah.
got it. Hang up.
It's true. It's so true. And I think one thing that I have come to learn from this line of work, and I don't know if it's, I think it's positive, might come across as negative. We'll see. Is that there is a certain level that we have come to feel is okay or validate that everyone else needs to solve the problem. Like dead deer in the road blocking my roadway. I'm not pulling over. I'm calling someone else to drag it out of the road, or recently, I think most recently, this like blew my bubble was we had a bunch of storms here in California. I mean, we were just being dumped on for days and like the world was ending. California soil could not take it. It was
Yeah.
just confused. And people would call the city, and it would dump over to us because, of course, storms happen after hours. They don't happen during business time. And everyone's out, everyone's on call, everyone's working, right? And homeowners would call like, the storm's backing up, someone needs to get here. And it's like, the city's flooding, sir. Like you gotta get out there. I can't say this to them, but like put on your rain boots, get a
Yes.
rake and go hit that storm, move those leaves. Like no one's coming to save us when the whole city is drowning. Like you, as a part of this community, might have to go out and do things that you sometimes pay your city to do because we're so inundated. And I think that is a struggle for people. And I think when we have that mindset, it increases our call volume. Does that make sense?
No, it definitely does. Like, a lot
Okay.
of the ones we'll see is it's like, someone calling because there's an old man who's trying to fix his tire on the side of the road, and he's like
Yeah.
85. Like, someone should go out there and help him. And
Yeah.
I'm like, you just drove by. You were the one that was supposed to go out there and help him. Yeah, it's just
And I totally get, like, there's a level of safety, there's a level of those type of things. Of course, never do anything you don't feel comfortable doing, never put yourself in an unsafe position, sure. But there are a lot of things that we just assume that our city, our police officers, our firefighter, whatever, should be handling. And it's like, really, is this in our it's the civil versus criminal aspect that we deal with all the time in law enforcement. Like, this is actually not a criminal matter. Like, we are actually supposed to be dealing only with criminal aspects. And yet we come out for mental health stuff. We come out for every civilian neighbor complaint. I mean, like, it's just this blanket where we're trying to reel it in a bit. We should have a lot more services for folks who are having mental health crisis and things of that nature. But yeah, we do become like this blanket response for people when they don't know what to do.
They conflate, the non-emergency line with the city services line. That's really what it is. And from a caller perspective, I think maybe this is, speaks to more like a farther problem of like, hey, maybe what we should be thinking about is how can we unify city services in a way that makes it really easy for people to be sent to the right place so that they're not just sending everything to the non-emergency line or not sending everything to, the city services line.
And I would imagine you guys, if you guys get those type of calls, probably on the non-emergency automated system, you guys are filtering those like back down to city services, or how does that look?
Yeah, so it ends up being kind of varied depending on what the city actually needs. But like, one of the examples that we see a lot of is people call the non-emergency line because they need to like check on the status of a warrant.
Oh.
Kind of reasonable because like you think of that like, law enforcement, non-emergency line, but really what that needs to go to is like the county jail often.
Yeah.
So we'll send those calls to the county jail. obviously, like we'll do like some basic forwarding, but I would say like surprisingly, when we first started this, we thought that routing was going to be a very high number of our calls.
Mhm.
In reality, it's like relatively low. What ends up
Mhm.
being the vast majority are just like actual complaints,
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
minor non-emergent complaints. It's like theft. It's um, you know, noise complaints, barking dogs, animal related complaints.
Mhm.
It's,
Mhm.
kind of runs the whole gamut, but like general police complaints ends up being the
Mhm.
vast majority of the call volume.
Okay. And I would say, like, again, like I mentioned earlier, one of the biggest things when I think dispatch centers struggle with in regards to software is just kind of this wall of communication, or like, I wouldn't say I've had this experience, but I can imagine this being an experience. We're in the sell phase, right? Like, Max is trying to sell me this product, communicating. I get into the center. The first time it breaks, all of a sudden Max is on vacation every week. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So,
sorry. Yeah, man. I mean, cake
yeah,
it
like,
in.
oh yeah, I'm glad. Thanks for finding the product. So how do you guys like work with the centers once you have it in there? Are they able, I mean, we're 24/7, right? Like, so are we able to reach out 24/7? Is there a way to constantly communicate with you folks to improve the software or ask questions, etc.?
Yeah, and this is like what makes I would say what makes this a really hard solution is that
Uh,
the number and the variety of calls that come in through the non-emergency line is really high.
mhm,
So making a system that like handles all of these calls well is really difficult. And the
mhm,
way that we do it is that we're like constantly working with the actual dispatchers to
mhm,
actually like figure out like what we need to be adding. And a lot of this is like we get a call for something that we don't really know how to handle. So what we'll do
mhm,
is we'll take a message
mhm.
and we'll review all the calls that we take a message, because oftentimes they take a message, there's a chance that the dispatcher has to call them back, which is our like worst nightmare because
Yeah.
dispatchers hate having to call someone back.
Yeah.
Um, so we kind of go through those calls and we see like, oh, okay, this person called about a fish and wildlife complaint. Like, okay, there's a reason we didn't have this route. We didn't really need one. Let's kind of make
Mhm,
sure that the system knows that if someone calls for that, like we should direct them to fish and wildlife.
mhm,
So then we
mhm,
slowly, we start with a pretty good understanding of what their total call volume is like,
mhm.
what it comprises of. Maybe that covers 80 to 90% of the actual call volume. And then from there, it's really just an iterative process of
Yeah.
talking to the dispatchers and figuring out what are we missing, going through some of our automated monitoring to make sure that the system gets better.
Mhm,
Um, when it comes to like, 24/7 support or anything like that, if anything goes down, like we're always available 24/7. Like you guys
mhm.
work 24/7, we have to as well.
Yeah.
But for the vast majority of these like small, we're talking about maybe it's less than 0.5% of your call volume.
Mhm,
Usually that's going to solve desync. And there's a few different ways. Like one, like we can add the knowledge into the system ourselves, but also we
mhm.
just make it so that dispatchers and supervisors can do it themselves as well.
Oh, that's nice.
So like the
Mhm,
example that I always like is like Memorial Day, we got a ton of calls for fireworks. So we just
mhm,
had it to the system said, if you're complaining about fireworks, I'm sorry, it's Memorial Day.
mhm.
Is effectively what it said.
Yeah. Mhm,
Like you're gonna
mhm.
have to put up with it. Like I know your dog doesn't like fireworks. Like
And let me record it. Look, you just call, "Hey, this is Ashley. Hello, happy Memorial Day. Stop calling us."
that's like literally what it can be. Um, so that's kind of effectively how it works. But like I said, like really, it is an iterative process of
Mhm,
we're trying to create what I like to call like a digital twin of the city
mhm.
services for the area that you represent.
Interesting.
And a lot of this knowledge is like it's not written down. It's just
Mhm.
like dispatchers know how to handle certain types of calls.
Yeah.
It's like
Mhm.
comparatively to 911, non-emergency is just it's a cluster. Like the
Yeah.
variety is unbelievable.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that's kind of how we like slowly make the system over time cover more and more of the calls.
So what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you utilize the software, utilize this technology to build off of the information that you're dumping into it, right? So if supervisor Ash or dispatcher Ashley says this equals call this, you kind of dump that into the system and you're able to generate something that reflects that city rather than like the city trying to fit the software.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
okay. Very
Yeah.
cool.
And like what we find is that like most cities want to handle certain things certain ways. So we have like a little bit of a baseline, but like
Mhm.
really fundamentally, what it needs to be is a representation of your city and
Yeah.
how you guys handle things.
Very cool. Well, how do folks learn more? How can they connect with you? How can they check out a demo? What does that process look like for you guys?
Yeah, honestly, just anytime I'm always available over email. Just answer any questions. And I think we may have some demos posted online, but honestly, one of the biggest issues with demos that I found is that I'll like take all this time to make a demo, and then by the time people actually see it, the system's so different. And then they're like, "Oh, like, in the demo, I noticed it was a little bit slow, like, sometimes it had to think before it said things," and it's like,
Mhm.
"Oh, yeah, by the way, those times are, like, cut in half now." Uh, so I'd say we don't have a great demo out. The thing is I always just like talking about it, and what I think is the most important aspect of this, and we kinda covered this a little bit, is making sure that, like, this is something that is useful for you.
Mm,
We never wanna be a solution in search of a problem.
mm,
So the reason why like we think one of the most important steps is just like learning about the specific center and the specific problems that they have to determine like
mm.
if this even is a decent idea for them.
Yeah.
Um, which I think is like, usually why we like doing these over calls.
I like that idea. I like that, like, you're acknowledging, like, it might not be a good fit for them. Like, we need to have a conversation to see if it's gonna work, you know?
Yeah,
Um,
like some places just don't have that many non-emergency calls, or sometimes
yeah,
they're just like small centers. Small centers
yeah,
sometimes just don't have the problem,
yeah,
and it just doesn't make sense at all for either of the parties involved.
yeah, yeah, 1000%. Awesome. Well, is there a website? Is there an
Yeah, yeah,
email?
yeah. So yeah, Aurelian.io, perfect website. You can book a demo through there. I'm always available at max@Aurelian.io. We can, I don't know, send the email out elsewhere. But yeah, no, I appreciate you having me and just like being able to share a little bit about it. I didn't want to make it too promotional. I feel like all we did was talk about the product, but
Yeah. Hey,
um,
the product is amazing, but I think the tech behind the product is what folks want to hear, right? Is like how it works, how is it going to make my life easier or harder?
yeah.
Like we're wanting to like really highlight that stuff. And I really do appreciate um your guys' willingness to go into these centers, have these conversations, figure out like the real life struggles that dispatchers are dealing with their tech in general, with their callers. I mean, it just goes a long way for software in our centers.
Well, yeah, I appreciate that. Like the thing that we've always said is like we're not dispatchers, so the only way for us to learn about your problems is to talk to you.
For
Uh,
sure.
and it ends up being like incredibly helpful because like you guys have a lot of problems. That's the hard part, is that it's just focusing on the ones that we think we can have the biggest impact in solving.
Yeah. Well, one of the questions that I ask everybody is, what advice would you give someone considering a career in dispatch? And obviously, you're not a dispatcher, so I'm going to change it a little bit to really gear more towards maybe the supervisors or the folks who are, pulling the strings in regards to the software and dealing with these companies that are impacting our centers. What advice would you give to folks who are working with vendors of how to communicate or advocate for changes in software in your centers?
Yeah, so I'd say the number one thing that I always say is like I think people need to hold their private sector partners to just generally a higher standard and
Mhm,
push them in every way that they can.
mhm,
So the few ways top of mind that I always like to say is like, well, one, be very open with the problems that you have
mhm,
in every way that you possibly can. So,
mhm,
and the other thing that I'd like to say with that is having a sense of urgency. Like this needs to be fixed now for things that are actually urgent is really useful.
mhm,
Um, you know, the thing that we talk about as a company is like the only way that you make things better is by like velocity and by maintaining velocity. And a lot of what ends up being a hiccup, or it can be a hiccup for private sector partners, is the velocity of the actual center. So
mhm,
like a lot of the early centers that we've worked with have had such a big sense of urgency that's helped us push the product forward and helped, get it directly into the hands of dispatchers, get their
mhm,
feedback as fast as possible and have that level of, clarity between the expectations of what's going to be what the system's for and how it's going to be handled. That ends up
mhm,
being really useful. And, the last thing that I'll kind of leave with on this whole overarching, like, how can we actually, get more out of our private sector partners?
mhm,
Be willing to take risks where the value is high and the risk is low.
mhm,
And for me, that's like anything that can help the life of a dispatcher that isn't handling 911 calls. So
mhm,
I always say like dispatchers are really good at handling 911 calls.
mhm,
Um, let them do their job and take away everything that you possibly can that's not that.
Mm.
And whether that's like, spending a lot of time on DORs and like having a good sense of like, what is your administrative burden versus like your operating burden. So like the number that I always look at with this is like, take your total operating budget and divide it by the number of calls that you're handling every single year. And that kind of gives you like a good sense of how efficient your center is.
Yeah.
And what we usually find is that like small centers, mostly because you have like mandatory staffing, end up being very inefficient on that level.
Yeah.
Middle centers are the most efficient. And then surprisingly, large centers are like surprisingly inefficient some of the time. And having an understanding of kind of where you fall at and how you can make the center work a little bit better ends up being really useful and like an overarching theme of making dispatchers' lives more like better.
Yeah. I think it's great advice. And I think it's a lot of things that kind of go to the waistline when you're dealing with all this other stuff, right? But it's so important if you deal with this aspect of it, a lot of those other things are going to fade away as well. So I really appreciate that advice. I think it's wonderful advice.
Well, it's just so hard to look into the future when there's always so many fires going on.
Seriously.
Like, and that definitely seems like one of the overarching problems that we see. It's just like really hard to think about tomorrow, and today it's like literally on fire.
Yeah, legit, like holes everywhere. We're just trying to plug them up.
Yeah.
Well, again, Max, thank you so much for coming on to the show, sharing the cool software you guys got going on, and more importantly, sharing the point of view that you guys have with working with dispatchers and working with centers. It's refreshing, it's needed, and I think it's going to go a long way in continuing to build good software for our centers.
Well, thank you. It was great being on. I really appreciate your time.
Awesome. I'll be right back with you. All right, everybody. Another amazing episode here on Let's Talk Dispatch. I will be including all of the information, the emails, the website in the information section of this episode in order for you guys to connect with Max. Again, I really do want to reiterate that when companies have this perspective in working with our centers and really wanting to build something that impacts our day-to-day, makes us actually less burnt out. Like, I'm all for that. And I think it's a great mindset to have. And I think Max's advice about holding our private sector partners accountable is going to go a long way and needs to happen for sure. So if you guys are interested, definitely check out the website. Again, it'll be in the information section of this episode. Head to theraspydispatcher.com for all of our resources. And if you're interested in coming onto the show, until next time, stay raspy, everybody. Thank you for listening to Let's Talk Dispatch podcast. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You can find us wherever you listen to podcasts, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you're interested in becoming a guest on the show, or maybe even submitting your own story, you can do all that and more at theraspydispatcher.com. Until next time, stay raspy.